These are indeed extraordinary images of panic around a Russian arms plant. You can hear, in fact, the gunfire of what is likely to be security personnel shooting up at what they think are drones about to hit the area around them. But also, it's extraordinary because of how deep inside Russia this was, 800 miles inside, hitting what a Ukraine security official tells CNN was a target they were aiming at, the Kupol electromagnetic plant, which Ukraine says is responsible for the construction of Tor missiles, OSA anti-missile systems, and indeed the Garpia attack drone used frequently across the front lines by Russia. Russian officials, though, say that 3 people were killed in this attack and 35 injured. Unclear if they were civilians or people working at the factory plant itself. But Izhevsk, where this attack occurred, so key to Russia's arm industry, but it comes at a time of bad news for Ukraine across the front lines, and indeed suggestions today from some Ukrainian military bloggers that in fact they've lost the largest amount of territory on the front lines in June for a number of months as Russia continues its slow incremental advances, not quite the vast summer push that many had expected yet, but suggestions Russia is amassing over 100,000 troops near the strategic eastern town of Pokrovsk and possibly 50,000 near the northern Ukrainian city of Sumy. Many deep concerns about what Russia's intentions may be in the weeks ahead, even if Ukraine is increasingly showing how deep inside Russian territory it can penetrate with some accuracy.
3 people were reportedly killed and dozens more injured early Tuesday after Ukraine struck a missile production facility deep inside Russia. Russian officials say the missile hit the factory in the industrial city of Ivskevsk. Video from social media captured explosions and people running, as you can see there, from the blasts. A Ukrainian source tells CNN that Ukraine used long-range drones to strike the plant. And this comes after Ukrainian reports that Russia launched its largest known drone attack on Kyiv since this full-scale war started. I want to take you to Warsaw now and bring in Poland's Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski for perspective on the latest fighting between Ukraine and Russia, and of course much more. Foreign Minister, good to have you back on the show. Let me start with those strikes deep inside Russia, because they come just a day or so after Keith Kellogg, the US senior envoy for Ukraine, said on X, I'm going to quote him here, Russia cannot continue to stall for time while it bombs civilian targets in Ukraine. Do you agree with that? And what pressure can the US, can Europe put on Putin to stop this stalling game?
I completely agree with General Kellogg. And in fact, this is the vein in which I spoke at the NATO summit last week in the presence of Secretary Rubio. Vladimir Putin is mocking the peace efforts of President Trump. He's increased his attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine since President Trump started his peace effort, and he's doubled them again since Israel's and the US attack on Iran. So I hope the US now does the right thing in response to Russian intransigence and war crimes.
And I assume this intransigence hasn't really moved at all, because we're seeing Putin, the French President Emmanuel Macron, we understand, in the last, half an hour or so, held a call with President Macron, the first call since September 2022. And Putin told Macron that any agreement to end the war would, quote, have to be based on new territorial realities. That, it doesn't seem, Foreign Minister, like we've moved at all when it comes to forcing Putin to the negotiating table. So what else would work here?
Well, I hope the Lindsey Graham bill gets attention in US Congress, because that would, for the first time since the assumption of office by President Trump, put some extra pressure on Putin. He only responds to pressure.
Let me put to you what I heard you say, and I thought it was really interesting. I heard you say, and I think this was at NATO, you can correct me, that the closer you are to Russia, the more you spend. I mean, that is certainly the case for Poland. You are the biggest spender as a percentage, I think, of GDP. But there are concerns, Foreign Minister, that while an agreement may have been signed here and agreed at NATO, that there could be a slippage in the spending target at some countries. We're looking at a graphic of some of the NATO spending as a share of GDP. Is this something that concerns Poland? And what reassurances, if any, have you received on this front?
Well, first of all, remember that as non-US NATO members, we have already doubled our defense spending since President Trump first assumed office. What we have now pledged ourselves to do is to double again. If we do that, we'll be at the same level of spending as the United States, and that should be enough to deter Putin, which is why we should do it.
Are you okay, though, with Spain significantly lowering spending? Because we did hear from the Spanish Prime Minister saying they're not going to meet the percentage they need to meet. Prime Minister Sanchez saying, you know, I think he said that during the NATO summit, they wouldn't go there. They would spend 2.1% of GDP on defense. Are you okay with that?
Well, it's true that Spain has never been occupied by Russia. But Spain faces other risks. Russia is conducting a hybrid war against all of the West, and that includes arsons, that includes death squads, that includes espionage. It includes meddling in Africa, where Russia has used Africa's own resources to undermine governments and to create mass migration. And that's certainly something that Spain is concerned about.
And speaking of threats, last week, Foreign Minister, you were quoted in the media saying that increased spending on NATO defense would lead to collapse of Russia. Yesterday's Russia's Foreign Minister said NATO countries were responding to what he called an imaginary threat, and the increased defense spending would lead to the collapse of NATO. I mean, which side is spending too much on weaponry here? Just your reaction to that.
Well, first of all, the threat from Russia is not imaginary because we can see it every day. You know, sometimes when they bomb Ukraine, we in Poland can hear it. And we've already had Russian missiles and Russian drones breaching our airspace. So for us, it's a daily reality and not a piece of imagination. And secondly, Russia is spending far more than NATO has pledged itself to do. There are various estimates, but 6, 7, 8% of GDP Russia is spending. And of course, we are much richer than Russia. You know, our combined economies are more than 20 times bigger than Russia. So we can afford it. And they are treading the path of the former Soviet Union. You know, the reason why my comment landed in Russia is that I was quoting Vladimir Putin himself, who some years ago said that the Soviet Union bankrupted itself, and he's now going down the same sinkhole.
Let me stay with Poland for a moment, because I understand your country, Foreign Minister, is going to impose temporary controls on borders with Germany and Lithuania, and I think it begins as of July 7. Would you just explain to our viewers why Poland's doing this? How long would it last? I know it's not the only country, but why now? And how long would these temporary measures, temporary controls last?
Well, Germany imposed controls in October 23 under the treaty in the EU that governs it. You can do it temporarily, but it's almost 2 years. And it's also tightened procedures recently. We have won our battle over the control of our border with Belarus. Russia and Belarus, on purpose, they bring migrants from Asia, Africa, and try to push them into the EU. We have spent over €500 million building a big and beautiful fence with sensors, and it's 98% effective. But unfortunately, some of our neighbors, Lithuania and Latvia, have not quite done it yet. And so some migrants have been redirected that way, which is why that unfortunately we're having to introduce this measure. Poland is in favor of free movement across the territory of the EU, but everybody have to do their share.
But do you have a sense, Foreign Minister, of how long this temporary measure will last? I know that Germany's lasted way more than was expected, but is there a time limit here?
That will depend on the flows of migrants. As I said, it stopped on the Polish-Belarusian border, despite the Belarusian regime's best efforts. So we need to take control, and we are doing it. And when our people have a sense of security, then and when we amend our legislation, our procedures in Europe, and regain the ability to decide who may or may not travel, then the controls will become superfluous.
Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, thank you very much, Foreign Minister. Great to have you back on the show.
Pleasure. Bye.
Thank you.